This is the DarshanTalks podcast, regulatory guy, irregular podcast with host Darshan Kulkarni. You can find the show on Twitter at DarshanTalks or the show's website at DarshanTalks.com.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Darshan Talks. We have Donna Tobin with us, and Donna is the trademark lawyer extraordinaire. She is the person I talk to when I have a lot of trademark questions. Donna, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Darshan. I'm so happy to be here. You are my FDA person. I rely on you a lot, so I appreciate that very much, and I appreciate the chance to talk to you. My name is Donna. I am a trademark lawyer, and I've been practicing in the trademark space, both litigation and prosecution, for 35 years. A lot has changed since then. A lot has stayed the same. I do all things trademark: clearance, food, drug, lots of, consumer goods. Everything is a little nuanced and a little bit different when you talk about trademarking in different industries, which is what I do.
Donna, we lost your volume.
And I've been doing all of that for... Can you hear me?
Much better now for some reason. So we
okay. Yes, I am in the middle of the country where there's not a whole lot of cell service.
Well, that's okay.
Anyway, as I was saying, different industries, trademark considerations. So I think it's wonderful that you've chosen to focus, as you have here today, on drug names.
Yeah. So as we discussed earlier, what we're going to end up talking about is naming of pharmaceuticals and what the different issues are. And the FDA came out with a recent guidance talking about how they look at naming of drugs. But Donna, you've been involved in this process before. First of all, when you are asked to help with a potential name, what is the first thing you do? What is it that you start considering? What are the considerations going through your head?
So typically from my side of things, generally, and of course there are other pieces of it when you're talking about pharmaceuticals, but generally I look at, is a client going to get sued if they use this name?
Right.
Is the client going to be able to register this name federally and enforce it against other people, other users, other, third parties? Those are the big buckets. Is use okay, and is registration okay? And those are two different considerations. Just generally in the United States, trademark rights are created upon use. So until you use something, you can't register it. But using it doesn't necessarily mean you can register it. So you really need to focus on both. The use is really real world. Am I going to get a nasty letter or a lawsuit if I use this? Registration is really in a vacuum. The trademark office doesn't look at what's happening in the real world when they're considering, are you entitled to a registration? They just look at their own register and whether anyone else has registered something conflicting and whether it comports with the trademark laws of the United States in terms of registration. So they're really two different worlds, and those are the first two considerations. So
what are the things that usually stop a person from how should I put this? From registering, first of all? Let's start with the registering.
Okay. So typically what we recommend is at least what we call a knockout search. And that's really a very quick initial consideration of whether you should spend your money pursuing a registration for this mark and using it, right? Because if you can't register it, often you won't want to roll it out anyway. I mean, there are exceptions which we can talk about, and I think we should. But back to what we do first. So we do a preliminary search, which is a quick check of the trademark office registrations, pending applications, history of those things, how many entities are existing in the same space. So for example, if everybody has a mark, that starts with Acme for the same kind of things, it indicates that everyone has narrow rights, and maybe there's another one that can fit in there. But so we look at all that. The reason it's called a knockout is because if someone has the same mark for the same goods registered, it's probably a good idea to move on.
Right.
Because you're probably going to not get that. You definitely won't get it registered unless something extraordinary happens. And you might get sued. So that's our knockout. And then because rights are created upon by use, there are people in the United States, including big companies, drug companies, other kinds of companies that have important brands that they don't register, but they still have rights in them. So they can literally come out of the woodwork once you're up and running, and you wouldn't know about them unless you moved on to the next stage of searching, which is what we do next.
So what is the next stage of searching?
The next stage is ordering a full search from a vendor that looks at every single use in the country that they can possibly look at, has lots of algorithms and lots of databases, and looks at state registrations, state business uses, state corporate names, digests, professional digests, all sorts of things, lots and lots of things, magazines, to get an idea of what common law uses there are, unregistered uses, or someone has invested time but just didn't register it and still would have rights. That's a much more comprehensive review. And once we analyze all of those and come up with a conclusion based on that, what the risks are of adoption and whether you're going to be able to get a registration, assuming that's cleared, we then can go forward and file the application.
So what I hear you saying is when you are looking at a situation where a potential mark is going to be registered, you're looking at not just the registration itself, but the use. And that's great because those are two different questions that have to be answered. What I didn't hear you talk about is talking about what the FDA will actually approve. So how does that work for you usually? How do you deal with interagency issues?
You're talking about the FDA as opposed to the USP. Okay.
Correct.
Well,
correct.
So the fact that they're two government agencies doesn't mean that they talk to each other or have the same kind of reviews, frankly. And it's important to note that if you get something registered in the USPTO and the US Trademark Office, it does not give you the right to use that mark in connection with your pharmaceutical product as far as the FDA is concerned, right?
Right.
So there are two different reviews that have to go along in a certain timing.
Yeah.
So that you wind up where you want to be with the FDA saying you can use it and the PTO saying you can register it. And they look at similar but different things when they're considering that, and they have different timelines. So the FDA looks at things that, and I'm paraphrasing, and I'm sure, Darshan, you can jump in here, but look at not registering names that are misleading with other names, right? They don't want you to register things that imply effectiveness or imply some way that the drug does something beneficial, right? I mean, there are some guidelines against making proclamations about what your drug does. Did you want to add?
Yeah, well, I can talk a little bit about it. I mean, I think it comes down to FDA is really looking at just how does this actually impact the patient and impact considerations in healthcare delivery. It starts by looking at something called the POCA tool, which is the phonetic and orthographic computer analysis tool. It does want you to actually consider things like, maybe you don't want to put your proprietary name shouldn't include your inert or inactive ingredients, just because that could cause confusion. Saying something like, I'm making this up, but OxyContin sodium would probably not be the best way to take that because it could later on cause other problems. Don't talk about using a combination of proprietary names of the active ingredients if you have it. You could also think about things like extensions and what implications that has. So, and then you don't want to reuse for example, an old name that got kicked out. And that actually brings me to a question that, Donna, you and I briefly talked about. How does naming work? What are some problems you've actually seen when you're helping with a drug name? You mentioned timelines.
Let's talk about the substance just for a minute in terms of what I look at. So assuming those two buckets are clear, right? I think you can register it, and I think you won't get sued if you use it.
Yeah.
The question turns to registration again, mostly in terms of, what kind of marks can get through. And some of the things you talked about on the FDA side are also relevant at the USPTO with a slight twist. So for example, nobody can register a generic name for a drug. Let's get that out of the way. The PTO won't even let you register, generic names for anything. So you can't register Apple for a fruit, but you can register it for a computer. So the generic name of something is never registrable. I think both sides agree with that.
Yeah.
But then you move into murky territory. So descriptiveness at the FDA sounds like things maybe explaining the efficacy, right? Like hair growth or some other thing that explains what the drug might do. That probably isn't going to get through the FDA. The trademark office will initially reject descriptive marks, except if you're using them for a long amount of time and you can prove that people actually recognize this as your product, you can get descriptive marks through. So that's probably another whole discussion, but that's where things differ a little bit. You can get descriptive names through in the PTO eventually. And then you can't be misdescriptive in the trademark office, but you can't be misleading in the FDA.
Yes. So what's the difference? What is misdescriptive?
So misdescriptive would be something, let's say I have a cough remedy called
Cough Away.
Honey cake.
Honey cake, okay.
If that product does not have honey, I can't get that registered.
Fair enough. But what if I'm trying to suggest that this is as good as honey?
That would be the argument that you would make. So the trademark office goes through their own review, and one of the things they look at is, would anybody, this is my own editorial, would anybody in their right mind think that cough medicine has honey in it? Maybe yes.
Is that the legal standard? Anybody in their right mind?
It's really, would the relevant consuming public assume that the product has honey in it? So, if it's an aspirin, they may not assume it has honey. If it's a cough medicine, they would. I mean, you have to go through that procedure.
See, that's an interesting question you raised. With the relevant consuming public, in the case of a prescription drug, who is the relevant consuming public? Is that the physician? Is that the pharmacist? Or is that the patient? All of the above. Depends on the argument we're making.
Well, yeah. I mean, the trademark office, when you're trying to get a registration through, there is a lot of back and forth. There's cases that can be cited. There's a lot of back and forth with the trademark office in writing. And so you go through all of those analyses, and that's a very good question. Who is the relevant consuming public? But when you're looking at who's going to be misled, there's an argument that everyone down that chain that you just listed might be misled, right? Anybody that sees that mark might be misled into thinking something and making a purchasing decision. I mean, the trademark statutes are consumer protection statutes, right? Not necessarily health related. I mean, not. They're consumer protection. So when you're looking at it on that side, it's whoever might be misled into making a buying decision is really where you're looking on the trademark side.
So one of the things you talked about when we were talking offline is how these competing agencies can cause a problem in that the timelines don't match up, and then you have problems. Could you talk a little bit about some of the experiences you've had?
Yeah. So just looking quickly at the trademark process, which is somewhat clear in terms of timeline. If you file an application, you eventually have to prove that you've used that mark on those goods, right? And you can't do that until you get FDA approval. So you file your trademark application, and it goes through the process from filing to allowance. Assuming no major problems, we're talking about between 9 months and a year, where and the application will be approved. After that approval, it's published for opposition, which means anyone in the public, which mostly just means trademark lawyers who are watching this sort of stuff, can oppose it. But assuming it's not opposed, it gets allowed. But that trademark will not be registered.
Before you continue there, so let's say I'm a trademark lawyer who is in this business. How do I even know to think of every version of the name? Like, do I put like a Google alert? Like, what is it that I'm looking for? I assume someone like you is doing this.
No.
How does it work?
Yeah, you are looking at something called the official Gazette, which is published by the trademark office, that tells you every mark that's applied for once it's allowed. Or you do what we all do, which is hire a commercial watching service that watches and alerts you every time somebody is seeking to register something similar to your application or registration. And then we go through those and decide what you need to worry about and what you don't. But that's really the most effective way, you know. Otherwise, it's difficult to keep track of everything. You can do it in the U.S. and in foreign countries. So obviously, if you have a global drug rollout, you'd want to know that once you commit to a name and file in the PTO.
So in most cases, these companies are hiring you to not just get the name approved, but then keeping you on standby just in case someone else is coming up with Viagra instead of Viagra, and or whatever it is.
You have to be proactive.
Right. Okay.
I mean, you would hope, and one does hope, that the trademark office wouldn't register that, right? Because they conduct a substantive review, including, is the mark descriptive? Is it misdescriptive? Is it generic? Does someone else own it and register it and has registered it? And is there anybody else out? Is there anyone registered already, right?
Right.
And so when you get your registration through, you'd hope that they conduct that same process and find your registration and stop someone else. It's not always the case. You know, it's subjective. So the trademark office may not think, what did you say, Viagra and Viagro?
Sure. I hadn't even thought of that one. That's even better than
for hair growth. And one would hope, but it happens often than not that things slide through that an owner would object to, and then you have to be proactive and file an opposition. So you do have to be aware of those things, and keeping an eye on the register through a third-party watching service is the best way to do it, and make your decisions. You know, decide what are you going to fight, what are you not going to fight, and that's kind of how you define your rights.
Okay, so we've now reached a situation where you've got people looking at this. So I'm sorry, I cut you off in your timeline. So
yeah, we were talking about timing. Hope we're not running out of time to talk about timing.
No.
So
I know we've got two different people saying that they're loving this.
That's good.
That's
Thank
good.
you. That's good. So you have an idea of the trademark office. You will probably get something registered, assuming no problems and nobody opposes you, within about a year, right? That could be a problem, because if you haven't gotten approval from the FDA to use your drug, you can't use it. And then you can't prove use in the PTO, so you can't register. So the trademark office has something called an intent to use application.
Mm-hmm.
You can file the intent to use application. It goes through like a normal application. But once it's approved, you have 3 years to prove use. So you have to keep paying an extension fee every 6 months, but you can keep it alive while you hear from the FDA. So, you know, the FDA can take a long time sometimes, or it can go through more quickly. I think the best thing to do is to file that sooner rather than later, and then give some thought to the trademark process and when you want to file that, keeping in mind that you'll have 3 years from allowance. So the smallest amount of time you'll have is 4 years. You'll have at least 4 years to use. And that gives you some time to figure out when to file the FDA application. But also, you probably want to think about whether you want your competitors to know what you're doing because
Yeah.
the trademark register is public the minute you file. You know, you want to beat people out before they beat you out. So that's the other side of that coin. So given that 4-year kind of rough timeline, it's really informal, but that's how it works out. You can figure out when to file in the FDA and when to file your trademark application so that hopefully both roads meet, even though they're going through slightly different processes. And of course, you need to give some thought before you even file what you're filing. Is it descriptive? Is it misdescriptive? Is it generic? Is someone else registering it? All those things.
So you've got a situation, let's say, where your timelines didn't meet, and you said you can file extensions. How many extensions can you file?
5 6-month extensions, so that it equals 3 years after the allowance. So when it's allowed, you get 6 months. No, well, after it's allowed, you get 6 months to prove use. And then you can request, you have 5 more extensions of 6 months to bring it up to a total of 3 years. So the notice of allowance date is the important date. And then the clock starts ticking on 3 years. That's statutory deadline, and it's not extendable. Well, there's a grace period of 6 months if you pay more money, but otherwise it's not extendable. So really, it's 3 years from the notice of allowance.
Okay.
That's it. That's really a solid line. I mean, there are fees you can pay, but the drop dead number is 3 years. The application to notice of allowance isn't a statutory deadline, but it roughly takes a year, which is why I'm saying you have about 4 years.
So you have a total of about 4
have 3.
years. Okay. So what I'm hearing from an FDA perspective is that you really you're probably talking about a late phase 2B 3A timeline when you're going to bring the drug. You're starting to test the efficacy of the drug. You kind of know that it works in terms of safety. You're starting to engage your promotional groups, which might be 2A, 2B, typically in the 2B area, phase 2B. And that's when you're going, let me bring someone like Donna to make sure that let me make sure that this drug is going to carry on. So, by the way, I already have someone who has a question for you.
Okay. I also want to mention something that we probably won't have time for, but maybe the people who are listening would want to hear about the rest of the things you can do, which is you can protect drug colors and drug tablet design and that sort of thing, which is a whole separate podcast probably. But names are not the only thing you can think about when you're protecting pharmaceuticals. Anyway, I would love to hear the question.
Well, this is slightly off topic, but it's relevant. So here's the question. Can you see the question?
I think so, yeah.
I released a pharmacy podcast, the logo and name in 2009, then turned into Pharmacy Podcast Network in 2012. Do I need a trademark on PPN, which is Pharmacy Podcast Network?
Well, that's a good question. So the question is really one of enforcement, right? Because once you have a registration and now you're adding this new name, can your existing registration allow you to enforce?
Right.
I would say the quick answer from a trademark infringement standpoint is if you have a registration for a pharmacy podcast, you can make an argument that pharmacy podcast covers uses of Pharmacy Podcast Network because network is kind of descriptive and it doesn't really add anything to the name. If you're using Pharmacy Podcast Network, you're infringing my pharmacy podcast name. But if you want to get people who are using podcast pharmacy network or pharmacy podcast alone, I mean, the more things you register, the more terms you register, the broader your registration is. It's a question of money. So network, in my mind, doesn't make pharmacy podcast so different.
Yeah.
And you can rely on that registration to go after other people, and it will protect Pharmacy Podcast Network. And keep in mind, you also have common law rights. So even if you don't register it, in the places you are using the network part of it, you can sue people based on that common law name as well. But if you're going to change and use Pharmacy Podcast Orange, I would say you definitely want to register that, because now it's a different name altogether.
Right.
So that's kind of the way to think of it. If what you're adding is a more descriptive term, you probably can get away, if money, if budget is an issue, with your main registration. But if you completely change the name or add some term that gives it a different commercial impression, like what is Pharmacy Podcast Orange, something totally different, then you would want to register that.
So let's apply this. What if I actually go from aspirin to aspirin lipophilic? Not that it would make any sense, but let's assume that it did make sense. Lipophilic happens to be a scientific term which has a specific meaning, practically used very often. By the way, Todd does say, thank you, that was great insight. So thank you for that. But let's say we try to apply that to drugs.
Thank you, Todd.
And we said instead of aspirin, we're going to say aspirin effervescent or aspirin lipophilic, whatever it is. And the second word in that is super generic in that it's, like you said, it's descriptive. Can I come in and say, you know what, that is not what the original name covered? Or does does Bayer still own rights to the lipophilic as well? To the add-on tags, if you will. Did that question make sense? I feel like I rambled.
The quick answer is if they're generic add-ons, no one owns those, so no one can really stop you from using those. But if you're tacking them on to their proprietary name, you have an issue.
Right.
Does that they can stop you from using their proprietary name, and the fact that you've tacked on a generic name doesn't help you there. I guess that's the better way to say it, right? If I take aspirin and I tack on some generic name and I say, oh, I'm using this name, not aspirin, that's not going to help you. They're going to win.
Okay.
And in famous marks, if you're talking about a famous mark like Tylenol, you can probably not tack anything onto Tylenol, right? If it's not famous, you can get away with putting, a different trademark like Orange or something arbitrary that would change the meaning and change the commercial impression. But with famous names, and a lot of drug names, I guess, well, some anyway, are famous, that argument's not going to fly, because then it's really dilution, not just confusion, which is probably another podcast.
Well, we should have a different podcast and talk about dilution.
One of the things you asked me early on was, what do I think about? And in the registration space, one of the things people should think about early on is the 5 types of trademarks. Generic, don't even waste your time and money. Descriptive, like American Airlines, initially descriptive, now a great trademark, right? Because everyone knows what American Airlines is. They invested time and money and advertising through years. So descriptive can be registrable. Suggestive are things really that are not descriptive but kind of suggest. So, I'm not really thinking of a good example right now.
Sure. Something of pain away that takes away your pain.
Exactly. Maybe.
I have a question though.
Wait.
Yeah.
Wait, I just want to.
Yeah, please.
Arbitrary are things like Haagen-Dazs for ice cream. They made it up, right? Well, actually, arbitrary is Apple for a computer. That's arbitrary. Haagen-Dazs is made up. So it's always a great idea to make up a mark. Just invent something that will go through the trademark office. Nobody else has ever used it. The problem is it might not catch on in terms of brand traction, right? Descriptive marks are always the thing that people want to focus on, because that tells the consuming public what your trademark, what your product is. Anyway, I cut you off.
No, not at all, because I was cutting you off, so I appreciate that. My question for you is, why does anyone go after descriptive marks? It just seems so difficult to protect. I had a client who was fighting me on he wanted to use a descriptive mark, and he's like, I've got some equity invested into this. I really don't want to change it. I was like, but you can't protect it. What is the impetus here?
So you actually can, and if we have a couple minutes, there's a procedure.
Sure.
Again, look at American Airlines. So when they first, applied for it, if they hadn't used it at all, it would get rejected, right? Because it's descriptive. It describes an airline in America. If they had 10 or 30 or 50 years of use and millions of dollars of promotion, then they can argue, and probably rightly so, there's public recognition. This used to be descriptive, but now everyone knows exactly who American Airlines is, right? And so if you have at least 5 years of use, 5 years is kind of the benchmark. If you've been out there for 5 years and you then seek to register your mark, and you can prove by affidavit how much you've spent on advertising, what your revenues are, how many customers you have, you might be able to get a descriptive mark through. You probably will. And that happens a lot. You just have to claim that you now have secondary meaning or recognition based on your efforts in the marketplace. If you want to try to register it day one, you won't be able to get it on the principal register, but you can get it on something called the supplemental register, which is kind of a holding, it's kind of like a graveyard, not a graveyard, but like a holding pattern for descriptive marks.
Yeah.
So you're using it, right? You're waiting for that 5-year mark so you can get a principal registration. But in the meantime, you can use the R in a circle,
right,
which is reserved for registered marks. You can use that with your supplemental mark. It comes up in a search. So if anyone else is trying to register something, yours will come up. So those are good reasons sometimes, if someone's really married to a descriptive mark, to at least go the supplemental route and try to get some traction while you're waiting for the 5 years and all that recognition you're developing.
Now
but do you want to, the question is, do you want to invest money in something that is, arguably descriptive? That's really a business decision.
Now let's take another version of that, though. Let's say there's a situation where there is a generic name to a drug, and you're the only maker of that generic drug because no one else is making it. It's been abandoned for a while. I'm going to pick on potassium chloride for right now. Everyone uses potassium chloride right now. But let's say you're the only manufacturer of potassium chloride. Now, for 5 years, no one's coming in because they didn't think anything would happen. Now, there's a huge scientific discovery that suggests that potassium chloride could arguably cure cancer. In those specific situations, other people are going to try to come in and say, we too make potassium chloride. Can you say that in the 5 years that we're there, I have gotten rights to potassium chloride, and I have secondary meaning now because because I'm the only one who manufactured it, and therefore hold people off? No,
absolutely not.
I love it.
because that that's generic. You can never register a generic term.
You could never get a generic term. Never. Okay, even if you've been the only one on there. Okay. I didn't know if
you can see why. I mean, you can't stop other people from using the generic thing it is. The interesting question, the interesting point there is if you come up with a drug, right? Yeah. And there's a generic name. Yeah. Sometimes, particularly in other industries, people will come up with another generic, right? Yeah. Like the Velcro people probably should have come up with a better generic than hook and loop closure, because nobody uses hook and loop closure. But if they had come up with another generic to dedicate to the public, then no one would be using Velcro. So Velcro has become generic because there was no other generic choice. So the quick answer to your question is no, because that is clearly the generic name of that product, and everyone needs to be able to use it.
Very cool. So Donna, here's a question for you. If people want to reach you and they have more questions, where do they find you?
Usually New York City, although right now I'm in upstate New York. My email, dtobin, Tobin, at rccblaw.com is the best way to reach me.
Wonderful. And I hope we can have you back. I think we're planning on having some more podcasts about some really interesting things soon as well. So we'll probably hopefully be talking about food the next time around. So stay tuned, everyone. Thanks again, Donna.
Although I think we identified a lot of topics.
We did. We've identified a lot of topics. But that's what I love about these conversations.
Thank you, Darshan. Thanks, everyone.
This is the DarshanTalks podcast. Regulatory guy, irregular podcast with host Darshan Kulkarni. You can find the show on Twitter at DarshanTalks or the show's website at DarshanTalks.com.